and we wrote the slogan on a mirror. Campaign offices smell like coffee that forgives and carpet that remembers better promises. My name is Owen. I was communications director for a city council challenger who believed sidewalks could count as healthcare if you walked them with the right people. The man I loved was Luca, a public defender who could turn a docket into a prayer and a plea into an armistice. We rented a narrow apartment over a barber shop that lined up Saturdays like soldiers. On the fridge, we kept 3 rules on a curling index card. Be home when you say. Don't rehearse breakups. Kiss before sleep. We didn't write anything about strategists who sell hope by the yard, donors who treat ethics like garnish, or mirrors you use as whiteboards because the wall paint can't take any more slogans. The race tightened the way storms do when they discover land. Our opponent was an incumbent who smiled like he owned the calendar. His senior strategist, Tristan Vale, introduced himself at a candidate forum with a handshake that felt like a non-disclosure agreement. "We're colleagues," he said, which is how wolves introduce themselves to sheepdogs. Tristan was the kind of man who wore midnight blue suits and told lies that sounded like statistics. He once run a mayoral race into a landslide and out of a friendship. People called him necessary the way cities call traffic inevitable. Luca met him first accidentally in line at the courthouse espresso bar. "You're Owens," Tristan said, as if I were a building. Luca said, "I'm mine," with the smile he saves for prosecutors who confuse volume with evidence. When he told me that night, he rinsed the mugs the way you rinse an impulse you're not keeping. "He's handsome," he added, as if handsome were a misdemeanor. I said, "So is hubris," and kissed him by the sink until the kettle forgot to boil. Our campaign HQ occupied an empty storefront between a nail salon and a century-old bakery that acted as the neighborhood's memory. Volunteers stapled palm cards until their fingers learned to spell. I wrote press releases that tried to make verbs do the kind of work nouns take credit for. When I needed quiet, I'd step into the back room where we kept signs and anxiety. The mirror there, floor length, a remnant from whoever sold dresses before we sold futures, became our brainstorming canvas. I'd scrawl with a dry erase marker while the city talked to itself outside. Ezra arrived with a check and a handshake and a glance that traveled. He was a lobbyist for transportation solutions, which is the phrase you use when you've discovered how to install fees without inviting riots. He said he loved our candidates' data-forward compassion, a sentence that had been focus grouped until it squeaked. He also loved flirting as philanthropy. He watched me uncap a marker and smiled like he'd seen my feed. "You write like a person who knows where the exit is," he said. I said, "I write like I can't afford to be wrong." He placed the check on the table like a chess move and said he'd follow up about messaging alignment. When he left, the room kept his cologne like a tip. The intrigue started as weather. A polling memo from a firm I trusted but didn't admire found its way to my inbox with a subject line that underlined itself. "Tied within MOE. Must define incumbent now." Tristan had his own memo, probably with the same numbers and scarier adjectives. It meant both campaigns would go meaner without admitting we had. I drafted a contrast ad that made the incumbent look like a man who preferred ribbon cuttings to crosswalks. When I read it aloud in the mirror room, my reflection winced. Luca came by with empanadas and his quiet. He sat on a folding chair watching me underline phrases and erase them before they could stain. "You're hurting yourself to keep us clean," he said. "We're going to get muddy anyway." I put the marker down and pressed my forehead to his shoulder in the way a tired person remembers a profession older than his current one. "I can be careful," I said. He kissed the hinge of my jaw and said, "Be kind first." Tristan called me after midnight 2 days later. "There's a story about to happen," he said, voice smooth, punctuation considered. Your guy's old landlord found a stack of late notices. City desk has a draft. I pictured him at his desk with his tie loosened to suggest intimacy, the skyline behind him like a conspiracy. You mean you placed it, I said. He sighed, magnanimous. I mean you could round up your truth before someone else irons it. I thanked him the way soldiers thank weather reports. After we hung up, I stared at the mirror and wrote, in block letters, the thing I didn't want to say out loud. We owe the story our version first. I went to Luca in the dark. He turned on the bedside lamp with a thumb and handed me his attention. I told him about the notices, 5 years ago, a startup salary that arrived like a negligent god, a second job writing copy for a bank that wanted to borrow my conscience. Are they going to say we don't pay our bills? He asked. They're going to say I've evolved into responsibility, I said, which is how campaigners ask forgiveness. He took my hand, slid it under the sheet to the steady part of himself. You still owe me kissing before sleep, he murmured. I paid. We posted the story at dawn, a first-person thread from the candidate about rent, late fees, and the city's appetite for small failures. The piece landed like a sigh people could trust. Tristan's push alert came an hour later, angrier, with numbers we'd already briefed. That afternoon, Ezra texted me a photo of a bus shelter ad with my tagline on it and a note. Nice line. Who do I bill? I pretended the compliment was for the campaign and not the part of me that wanted to be seen. The kiss didn't happen at work. It happened at a fundraiser in an art gallery that thought concrete could be tender. I'd stayed too late cleaning up, drunk on the kind of praise that comes in lists. Ezra offered to walk me out because city blocks learn mischief after 10. In the alley, he stepped close enough to make the brick helpful. You're better than your candidate, he said, which is a thing men say when they want to reroute your electricity. I'm exactly my candidate, I said. Ambitious, he said. Boring, I corrected. That too, he added, and then he did what handsome men do when they want the next paragraph. He kissed me like he was fixing a sign that kept falling. I kissed back for the length of a mistake you can still file under curiosity. The city thunked somewhere. A delivery truck coughed. My phone buzzed, insistent. When I looked, it was Luca. Done yet? Bring home olives. I answered yes and stepped away from Ezra like the word boundary had been translated into muscle. I told Luca because the only way I can stand my job is to practice clarity at home. He listened at the kitchen counter, chewing an olive like it had applied for the right to be forgiven. Do you want him? He asked. I want his access, I said, and hated the part of me that meant it. He nodded, wiped his fingers, and came around to kiss me softly enough that my chest unclenched its algebra. We can do small, he said. We can do quiet, but don't bring home weather disguised as data. The next debate turned into theater. Tristan arranged the stage with blue uplights that made the incumbent look like a bank in a dark mood. I wrote our closing like a lullaby for angry people. Afterward, while volunteers stacked signs and the cameras grew bored, Tristan cornered me in the wings. You're good, he said, eyes on my mouth like he was reading. You're dangerous, I said. He smiled. Same sentence if you're sober. He leaned in, not enough to touch, enough to draw a line and dare me to cross it. I didn't. I could feel the mirror room on my back like a witness. The scandal we didn't deserve arrived a week later. A whisper to 3 reporters, then a blog post with a headline that knew what it was doing. Who's writing our candidates' late-night messages? The piece quoted 2 policy tweets from my account that had the cadence of my drafts and the personality of something that hadn't touched the candidate's brain. It tagged Ezra in a half-sincere question about influence. The implication was that I was the lobbyist stenographer. Luca texted a single question. You. I typed a long defense and deleted it. Then I wrote the truth, not as written. He sent back, that's the problem. We needed a clean story. I wrote a statement that admitted the obvious. Campaigns are committees and refused the smear. Ezra called to apologize with the tone of a man who doesn't. They're coming for me, he said. So they're coming for anyone who uses my calendar. Use somebody else's, I said. He laughed and invited me to a rooftop for air. I told him I was busy practicing virtue. Tristan texted a link to the blog with a shrug emoji that felt like a trapdoor. Then he called Luca directly. He'd saved the number from the courthouse line, asking for a quote about the ethics of messaging lawyers. Luca didn't give him one. He sent me the call log like an invoice. Someone thinks my boyfriend is a storyline, he said. I replied, my boyfriend is my ending. Election day arrives like a test you've known about for months and still cram for. I was up before sunrise, cycling through polling locations with extra pens and too much encouragement. Our volunteers smiled until their faces hurt. Our opposing poll watchers smiled like the cops do when they're calming a protest for the cameras. Around noon, a video surfaced. Ezra at a bar, arm around a donor, making a joke about buying transit one cocktail at a time. Tristan's team blasted it as proof our coalition preferred martinis to policy. I watched the clip and felt the bottom drop out of my desire. My phone rang. Ezra, I'm sorry, he said, first time that week he'd managed a full apology. Enjoy losing without me, I said and hung up, shaking like a man relearning gravity. I went to the mirror room, wrote a single word, home. Then I went to Luca's courtroom. He was finishing a plea that had been kneaded into fairness. He saw me in the back and didn't smile because work is work. Outside, under the limestone steps that make citizens feel small and safe, I asked him to tell me what to do. He said, win or don't, but tonight come home before you turn into a person who needs strangers to clap. I kissed him in daylight, which is my favorite genre. We won by 804 votes, a number small enough to feel private. Tristan called to congratulate me with a sincerity I almost believed. You'll be insufferable now, he said. I'll be employed, I answered. He laughed and then lowered his voice. You did the right thing pulling away from Ezra. He thinks he's gravity. Don't orbit people like that. I waited for the price tag. It didn't come. Good night, Owen, he said softly and hung up like a gentleman. The party spilled into the street. Our candidate cried the way men do when someone lets them. I hugged 73 people and lost my jacket to a volunteer who wanted to look victorious at a diner. When the music dipped, when the donors shook hands like they were writing history, I slipped out and walked home. Luca was on the couch with a bowl of popcorn he never eats past 10 but had kept alive for me. He turned down the volume, opened his arms, and I climbed in like I had learned something worth keeping. We went to the mirror and wrote a new rule under the old ones. Don't make a slogan out of a moment. Our palms smudged the letters, our mouths argued tenderly. We laughed because relief is a comedian. In bed, he pressed his lips to the place on my neck that forgives first and asked here, like a tradition. I said yes, and the evening understood how to land. When reporters called the next morning for quotes, I gave them nouns and verbs and nothing that needed perfume. I wrote a last post for the campaign account that thanked the sidewalks for keeping our feet honest. I sent Tristan a single-line email, good fight, and he sent back a period and a smile I could feel through the screen. Ezra sent nothing. His silence felt like a bar tab someone else would have to pay. We kept the mirror. Sometimes I catch my face in it and look like the man who almost converted flattery into policy. On those days, I go to the courthouse steps at lunch and let Luca talk about clients whose names he keeps private but whose stories have chosen him. He has a way of putting his hand on my chest when a sentence tries to run away and asking, with a glance, if I remember our address. I do. If anybody asks what saved us, I don't say discipline or virtue or smart strategy. I say smallness. We wrote the slogan on a mirror and then used the mirror for its original job, to check we hadn't turned into people we didn't like. We told truths before the room invented worse. We kissed before sleep. And when intrigue came dressed as influence and infidelity offered better lighting, we walked home under street lamps that forgive and let ourselves be boring in ways the city can't sell tickets to, which is my favorite kind of win.